YouTube. How are you doing today, YouTube? I'm doing so much better than I have been for a very long time. Not a very long time, just the past few weeks. Because I have my new computer. It's so exciting. It got here a week earlier than I thought it would. It was supposed to arrive on the 13th. It arrived yesterday. And oh my goodness, it's so nice to have a computer that is fast and can work and, it can live stream. New computer. Hello, Bill. Oh, yay. Yes, it's an old Dell computer. It's a Dell Latitude, and it looks like it was right from 1994, man. It's amazing. It's big and clunky. It has that little, rubber tip in the middle, so I can move sorry for the noise. A siren was going past, and I have the window open. But yeah, it's got that little rubber touchpad in the middle that I can sort of move the mouse around, and it also has the trackpad. But so it's pretty fun, and it can live stream. So it can live stream YouTube, but it can also do stuff on Twitch. So I am going to be live streaming gameplay on Twitch. It's really exciting. It is something I've always wanted to do, and now I can finally play video games for your entertainment. And I play video games very badly, so it will be plenty of entertainment. But we should dig right in to the Phantom Tollbooth. Last time we followed Milo in his adventures through this land. I really don't know the name of the land. It's just the kingdom, this particular fantasy kingdom that he's in. He was journeying through the forests in the middle of the kingdom because you have Digitopolis is in the north, that's where the numbers are, and you have Digitopolis in the south with King Azaz the Unabridged. Milo is journeying north to Digitopolis to meet the math magician. And he met Alec Bings, who thinks about things, who grows in the air and grows feet to the ground with his head in the same place as always. He also met Chroma, the conductor of color, who conducts the sunrises and the sunfalls and sunsets and everything in between. Milo conducted a bit himself, and it went poorly for him. And then he went to the Valley of Sound, which oddly enough has absolutely no sound. Because, as often happens, the person who was giving out all the sounds got very resentful at the lack of appreciation that was being given to the sounds. So she became very miserly and decided to withhold all sounds forever. And Milo went and talked to her. And when she went into when you go into the sound keeper, into her lair, you can talk. But if you leave it, you can't. And when we last left Milo, he had just he was trying to persuade her to release the sounds because the people had learned their lesson, but she was being very recalcitrant and refused. And he started to say but then he quickly closed his mouth before it came out, thus trapping the sound in his mouth. And he raced outside to see. So here's what happens next here's what he does with that trapped butt in his mouth. Chapter 13, Unfortunate Conclusions. With his mouth shut tight and his feet moving as fast as thoughts could make them, Milo ran all the way back to the car. There was great excitement when he arrived, as talk raced happily down the road to greet him. The humbug personally accepted all congratulations from the crowd. "Where is the sound?" someone hastily scribbled on the blackboard, and they all waited anxiously for the reply. Milo caught his breath, picked up the chalk, and explained simply, "It's on the tip of my tongue." Several people excitedly threw their hats into the air. Some shouted what would have been a loud hurrah, and the rest pushed the heavy cannon into place. They aimed it directly at the thickest part of the fortress wall and packed it full of gunpowder. Milo stood on tiptoe, leaned over into the cannon's mouth, and parted his lips. The small sound dropped silently to the bottom, and everything was ready. In another moment, the fuse was lit and sputtering. I hope no one gets hurt, thought Milo, and before he had time to think again, an immense cloud of gray and white smoke leapt from the gun, and, along with it, so softly that it was hardly heard, a sound came of "but." It flew toward the wall for several seconds in a high, lazy arc, and then struck ever so lightly just to the right side of the big door. For an instant, there was an ominous stillness, quieter and more silent than ever before, as if even the air was holding its breath. Then, almost immediately, there was a blasting, roaring, thundering smash, followed by a crushing, shattering, bursting crash, as every stone in the fortress came toppling to the ground, and the vaults burst open, spilling the sounds of history into the wind. Every sound that had ever been uttered or made, from way back when to where there were none, to way up to when there were too many, came hurtling out of the debris in a way that sounded as though everyone in the world was laughing, whistling, shouting, crying, singing, whispering, humming, screaming, coughing, and sneezing, all at the same time. There were bits of old speeches floating about, as well as recited lessons, gunshots from old wars, babies' cries, auto horns, waterfalls, electric fans, galloping horses, and a great deal of everything else. For a while, there was a total and deafening confusion, and then, almost as quickly as they'd come, all the old sounds disappeared over the hill in search of their new freedom, and things were normal again. The people quickly went about their busy, talkative business, and, as the smoke and dust cleared, only Milo and Talk, and the humbug, noticed the sound-keeper sitting disconsolately in a pile of rubble. "I'm terribly sorry," said Milo sympathetically, as the three of them went to console her. "But we had to do it," said Talk, sniffing around the ruins. "What a terrible mess," observed the humbug, with his knack for saying the exactly wrong thing. The sound-keeper looked around with an expression of unrelieved sadness on her unhappy face. "It will take years to collect all those sounds again," she sobbed, "even longer to put them back in proper order. But it's all my fault, for you can't improve sound by having only silence. The problem is to use each at the proper time." As she spoke, the familiar and unmistakable squinch, squanch of Din's heavy footsteps could be heard plodding over the hill. And when he finally appeared, he was dragging an incredibly large sack behind him. "Can anyone use these sounds?" he puffed, mopping his forehead. "They all came over the hill at once, and none of them are awful enough for me." The sound-keeper peered into the sack, and there were all the sounds which had burst from the vault. "How nice of you to return them," she cried happily. "You and the doctor must come for an evening of beautiful music when my fortress is repaired." The thought of it so horrified Din that he excused himself immediately and dashed off down the road in a great panic. I'm so glad the resolution quality is better. Yay! But I also ordered a webcam because I wasn't sure how it was going to be. And I guess now I have a webcam too, but that hasn't arrived yet. But anyway, I hope I haven't offended him, the soundkeeper said with some concern. "He only likes unpleasant sounds," volunteered Talk. "Ah, yes," she sighed. "I keep forgetting that many people do. But I suppose they are necessary, for you'd never really know how pleasant one was unless you knew how unpleasant it wasn't." She paused for a moment, but then continued, "If only Rhyme and Reason were here, I'm sure things would improve." "That's why we're going to rescue them," said Milo proudly. "What a long, hard journey that will be. You'll need some nourishment," she cried, handing Milo a small brown package, neatly wrapped and tied with string. "Now remember, they're not for eating, but for listening, because you'll often be hungry for sounds as well as food. Here are street noises at night, train whistles a long way off, dry leaves burning, busy department stores, crunching toast, creaking bed springs, and, of course, all kinds of laughter. There's a little of each, and in far-off lonely places, I think you'll be glad to have them." "I'm sure we will," replied Milo gratefully. "Just take this road to the sea and turn left," she told them. "You'll soon be in Digitopolis." And almost before she had finished, they had said goodbye and left the valley behind them. The shoreline was peaceful and flat, and the calm sea bumped it playfully along the sandy beach. In the distance, a beautiful island covered with palm trees and flowers beckoned invitingly from the sparkling water. "Nothing can possibly go wrong now," cried the humbug happily. And as soon as he'd said it, he leaped from the car, as if stuck by a pin, and sailed all the way to the little island. Look at him go! "Abe will have plenty of time," answered Talk, who hadn't noticed the bug was missing, and he too suddenly leaped into the air and disappeared. "It certainly couldn't be a nicer day," agreed Milo, who was too busy looking at the road to see that the others had gone, and in a split second, he was gone also. He landed next to Talk and the terrified humbug on the tiny island, which now looked completely different. Instead of palms and flowers, there were only rocks and twisted stumps of long-dead trees. It certainly didn't seem like the same place they had seen from the road. "Pardon me," said Milo to the first man who happened by. "Can you tell me where I am?" "Pardon me," replied the man. "Can you tell me who I am?" The man was dressed in a shaggy tweed jacket and knickers with a long woolen stockings, and a cap that had a peak both front and back, and he seemed as confused as could be. There's the man right there. That's one confuzzled-looking gentleman. "You must know who you are," said Milo impatiently. "You must know where you are," said the man with equal annoyance. "Oh dear, this is going to be difficult," Milo whispered to Talk. "I wonder if we can help him." They conferred for a few minutes, and finally the bug looked up and said, "Can you describe yourself?" "Yes, indeed," the man replied happily. "I'm as tall as can be." And he grew up straight until all that could be seen of him were his shoes and stockings. "And I'm as short as can be." And he shrank down to the size of a pebble. "I'm as generous as can be," he said, handing each of them a large red apple. "And I'm as selfish as can be," he snarled, grabbing them back again. "I'm as strong as can be," he roared, lifting an enormous boulder over his head. "And I'm as weak as I can be," he gasped, staggering under the weight of his hat. "I am as smart as I can be," he remarked in 12 different languages. "And I'm as stupid as I can be," he admitted, putting both feet in one shoe. "I'm as graceful as can be," he hummed, balancing on one toe. "And I'm as clumsy as can be," he cried, sticking his thumb in his eye. "I'm as fast as can be," he announced, running around the island twice in no time at all. "And I'm as slow as can be," he complained, waving goodbye to a snail. "Is that any help to you?" Once again, they conferred in busy whispers, until all three agreed. "It's really very simple," said the humbug, twirling his cane. "If everything you say is true," added Talk. "Then without a doubt," Milo concluded brightly, "you must be Canby. Canby. "Yes, of course! Yes, of course!" the man shouted. "Why didn't I think of that? I'm as happy as can be." Then he quickly sat down and put his head in his hands and sighed. "But I'm also as sad as can be." "Now will you tell us where we are?" asked Talk as he looked around the desolate island. "To be sure," said Canby. "You're on the island of conclusions. Make yourself at home. You're apt to be here for some time." "But how did we get here?" asked Milo, who was still a bit puzzled by being there at all. "You jumped, of course," explained Canby. "That's the way most everyone gets here. It's really quite simple. Every time you decide something without having a good reason, you jump to conclusions, whether you like it or not. It's such an easy trip to make that I've been here hundreds of times." "But it's such an unpleasant-looking place," Milo remarked. "Yes, that's true," admitted Canby. "It does look much better from a distance." As he spoke, at least 8 or 9 more people sailed onto the island from every direction possible. "Well, I'm going to jump right back," announced the humbug, who took 2 or 3 practice bends, leaped as far as he could, and landed in a heap 2 feet away. "That will do it all," scolded Canby, helping him to his feet. "You can never jump away from conclusions. Getting back is not so easy. That's why we're so terribly crowded here." That was certainly true. For all along the bleak shore and clustered on the rocks as far as anyone could see were enormous crowds of people, all sadly looking out to the sea. "Isn't there even a boat?" asked Milo, anxious to get on with his trip. "Oh no," replied Canby, shaking his head. "The only way back is to swim, and that's a very long and very hard way." I don't like to get wet, moaned the unhappy bug, and he shuddered at the thought. Neither do they, said Canby sadly. That's what keeps them here. But I wouldn't worry about it for too much, for you can swim all day in the sea of knowledge and still come out completely dry. Most people do. But you must excuse me now. I have to greet the new arrivals. As you know, I'm as friendly as can be. Over the humbug's strenuous objections, Milo and Talk decided to swim, and protesting loudly, the bug was dragged with them toward the sea. Canby hurried off to answer more questions. The last thing he was heard to say was, "Pardon me, can you tell me who I am?" They swam and swam and swam for what seemed like hours, and only Talk's firm encouragement kept Milo struggling through the icy water. At last they reached the shore, thoroughly exhausted and, except for the bug, completely soaked. That wasn't as bad at all, the humbug said, straightening his tie and brushing himself off. I must visit there again. I'm sure you will, gasped Milo, but from now on I'm going to have a very good reason before I make up my mind about anything. You can lose too much time jumping to conclusions. Amen. The car was just where they'd left it, and in a moment they were on their way again as the road turned away from the sea and began its long climb into the mountains. The warm sun and billowy breezes dragged them as they went. I hope we reach Digitopolis soon, said Milo, thinking of the breakfast they hadn't eaten. I wonder how far it is. Tea time. Manuka honey tea. The last tea bag. I don't know where I'll find that tea again. I'll just have to find something new. I like trying new teas. Chapter 14. The dodecahedron leads the way. Yay, D&D! Up ahead, the road divided into three, and, as if in reply to Milo's question, an enormous road sign pointing in all three directions stated clearly, Digitopolis, 5 miles. Oh God, numbers. I can't read numbers. Hey, husband!
Yeah?
Would you come here and read the numbers for me? Because they're very difficult to read. I can't read numbers, guys. Come, say them out loud. Say them.
Digitopolis, 5 miles, 1,600 rods, 8,800 yards, 26,400 feet, 316,800 inches, 633,600 half inches, and then some.
Whew. There's those for those of you that can do numbers. Yeah, it's dyslexia for numbers, and I just and especially when you ask me to like translate numbers into words, that is incredibly difficult. Let's travel by miles, advised Humbug. It's shorter. Let's travel by half inches, suggested Milo. It's quicker. But which road should we take? Asked Talk. It must make a difference. As they argued, a most peculiar little figure stepped nimbly from behind the sign and approached them, talking all the while. Yes, indeed. Indeed it does. Certainly yes, it does make a difference. Undoubtedly. He was constructed, for that's really the only way to describe him, of a large assortment of lines and angles, connected together into one solid, many-sided shape, somewhat like a cube that's had all its corners cut off and then had all its corners cut off again. And each of the edges was neatly labeled with a small letter, and each of the angles with a large one. He wore a handsome beret on top, peering intently from one of his several surfaces with a very serious face. Perhaps, if you look at the picture, you'll know what I mean. And it's actually written in there, so there's that picture. I think that makes a little bit more sense now, huh? Dyscalculia! Yes! Good for you. Good on you, Bill, for knowing that. Well done. Isn't it, though? The real word, dyscalculia. I've heard that before.
I think it's like calculus dyscalculia. I don't know where the emphasis is, but it's
somewhere?
It's somewhere.
I like putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable.
Dyscalculia.
Oh, yeah. And I'm sure whatever I do have, it's a mild form of it, but all I know is that sometimes numbers just flip, and there's nothing I can do about it. Anyway, once the figure reached the car, he doffed his cap and recited in a loud, clear voice, "My angles are many, my sides are not few. I'm the dodecahedron. Who are you?" "What's a dodecahedron?" inquired Milo, who was barely able to pronounce the strange word. "See for yourself," he said, turning around slowly. "A dodecahedron is a mathematical shape with 12 faces." Just as he said it, 11 other faces appeared, one on each surface, and each one wore a different expression. "I usually use one at a time," he confided, as all but the smiling one disappeared again. "It saves wear and tear. What are you called?" "Milo," said Milo. "That is an odd name," he said, changing his smiling face for a frowning one. "And you only have one face." "Is that bad?" asked Milo, making sure it was still there. "You'll soon wear it out using it for everything," replied the dodecahedron. "Now I have one for smiling, one for laughing, one for crying, one for frowning, one for thinking, one for pouting, and 6 more besides. Is everyone with one face called a Milo?" "Oh, no," Milo replied. "Some are called Henry, or George, or Robert, or John, or lots of other things." "How terribly confusing," he cried. "Everything here is called exactly what it is. The triangles are called triangles, the circles are called circles, and even the same numbers have the same name. Why, can you imagine what would happen if we named all of the 2s Henry, or George, or Robert, or John, or lots of other things? You'd have to say Robert plus John equals 4, and if the 4's name were Albert, things would be hopeless." "I never thought of it that way," admitted Milo. "Then I suggest you begin at once," admonished the dodecahedron from his admonishing face, "for here in Digitopolis, everything is quite precise." "Then perhaps you can help us decide which road to take," said Milo. "By all means," he replied happily. "There's nothing to it. If a small car carrying 3 people at 30 miles an hour for 10 minutes along a road 5 miles long at 11:35 in the morning starts at the same time as 3 people who have been traveling in a little automobile at 20 miles an hour for 15 on another road exactly twice as long as 1/2 the distance of the other, while a dog, a bug, and a boy travel an equal distance in the same time or the same distance in an equal time along a third road in mid-October, then which one arrives first and which is the best way to go?" 17! shouted the humbug, scribbling furiously on a piece of paper. Well, I'm not sure, but," Milo stammered after several minutes of frantic figuring. "You'll have to do better than that," scolded the dodecahedron, "or you'll never know how far you've gone or whether or not you've even gotten there." "I'm not very good at problems," admitted Milo. "What a shame," sighed the dodecahedron. "They're so very useful. Why, did you know that if a beaver 2 feet long with a tail 1.5 feet long can build a dam 12 feet high and 6 feet wide in 2 days, all you would need to build Boulder Dam is a beaver 68 feet long with a 51-foot tail?" "How would you find a beaver that big?" grumbled the humbug as his pencil point snapped. "I'm sure I don't know," he replied, "but if you did, you'd certainly know what to do with him." "That's absurd," objected Milo, whose head was spinning from all the numbers and questions. "That may be true," the dodecahedron acknowledged, "but it's completely accurate, and as long as the answer is right, who cares if the question is wrong? If you want sense, you'll have to make it yourself." "All 3 roads arrive at the same place at the same time," interrupted Talk, who had patiently been doing the first problem. "Correct!" shouted the dodecahedron, "and I'll take you there myself. Now you can see how important problems are. If you hadn't done this one properly, you might have gone the wrong way." "I can't see where I made my mistake," said the humbug, frantically rechecking his figures. "But if all roads arrive at the same place at the same time, then aren't they all the right way?" asked Milo. "Certainly not," the dodecahedron shouted, glaring from his most upset face. "They're all the wrong way. Just because you have a choice doesn't mean that any of them has to be right." He walked to the sign and spun it around 3 times. As he did, the 3 roads vanished, and a new one suddenly appeared, heading in the direction that the sign now pointed. "Is every road 5 miles from Digitopolis?" asked Milo. "I'm afraid it has to be," the dodecahedron replied, leaping into the back of the car. "It's the only sign we've got." The new road was quite bumpy and full of stones, and each time they hit one, the dodecahedron bounced into the air and landed on one of his faces, with a sulk or a smile or a laugh or a frown, depending on which one it was. "We'll soon be there," he announced happily after one of his short flights. "Welcome to the land of numbers." "Doesn't look very inviting," the bug remarked, for as they climbed higher and higher, not a tree or a blade of grass could be seen anywhere. Only the rocks remained. "Is this the place where numbers are made?" asked Milo as the car lurched again, and this time the dodecahedron sailed off down the mountainside, head over heels and grunt over grimace, until he landed sad side up at what looked like the entrance to a cave. "They're not made," he replied, as if nothing had happened. "You have to dig for them. Don't you know anything at all about numbers?" "Well, I don't think they're very important," snapped Milo, too embarrassed to admit the truth. "Not important," roared the dodecahedron, turning red with fury. "Could you have tea for 2 without the 2, or 3 blind mice without the 3? Would there be 4 corners of the earth if there weren't a 4? And how would you sail the 7 seas without a 7? "All I meant was," began Milo, but the dodecahedron, overcome with emotion and shouting furiously, carried right on. "If you had high hopes, you would know how high they were. And did you know that narrow escapes come in all different widths? Would you travel the whole wide world without ever knowing how wide it was? And how could you do anything at long last," he concluded, waving his arms over his head, "without knowing how long the last was? Why, numbers are the most beautiful and valuable things in the world. Just follow me and I'll show you." He turned on his heel and stalked off into the cave. Come along," he shouted from the dark hole. "I can't wait for you all day." And in a moment, they'd followed him into the mountain. It took several minutes for their eyes to become accustomed to the dim light, and during that time, scratching, scraping, tapping, scuffling noises could be heard all around them. "Put these on," instructed the dodecahedron, handing each of them a helmet with a flashlight attached to the top. "Where are we going?" whispered Milo, for it seemed like the kind of place you whispered in. "We're here," he replied with a sweeping gesture. "This is the numbers mine." Milo squinted into the darkness and saw for the first time that they had entered a vast cavern lit only by a soft, eerie glow from the great stalactites which hung ominously from the ceilings. Passages and corridors honeycombed the walls and wound their way from floor to ceiling up and down the sides of the cave, and everywhere he looked, Milo saw little men, no bigger than himself, busy digging and chopping, shoveling and scraping, pulling and tugging carts full of stone from one place to another. "Right this way," instructed the dodecahedron, "and watch where you step." As he spoke, his voice echoed and re-echoed and re-echoed again, mixing its sound with the buzz of activity all around them. Tok trotted along next to Milo, and the humbug, who stepping daintily, followed behind. "Whose mine is it?" asked Milo, stepping around 2 of the loaded wagons. "By the 4,827,659 hairs on my head, it's mine, of course." That number was written out so I could read it better. Bellowed the voice from across a cavern, and striding toward them came a figure who could only have been the math magician. He was dressed in a long, flowing robe covered entirely with complex mathematical equations and a tall, pointed cap that made him look very wise. In his left hand, he carried a long staff with a pencil point in one end and a large rubber eraser at the other. "It's a lovely mine," apologized the humbug, who was always intimidated by loud noises. "The biggest number mine in the kingdom," the math magician said proudly. "Are there any precious stones in it?" asked Milo excitedly. "Precious stones?" he roared, even louder than before. And then he leaned over Milo and whispered softly, "By the 8,247,312 threads in my robe, I'll say there are. Look here." He reached into one of the carts and pulled out a small object, which he polished vigorously on his robe. When he held it up to the light, it sparkled brightly. "But that's a 5, objected Milo, for that was certainly what it was. "Exactly," agreed the math magician. "As valuable a jewel as you'll find anywhere. Look at some of the others." He scooped up a great handful of stones and poured them into Milo's arms. They included all the numbers from 1 to 9, and even an assortment of zeros. "Here, check out the math magician. Kind of a scary fellow, huh? Looks wild and crazy. Like a mad genius." I gotta admit, I prefer Digitopolis, but I've always been a word person. "We dig them and polish them right here," volunteered the dodecahedron, pointing to a group of workers busily employed at the buffing wheels. "And then we send them all over the world. Marvelous, aren't they?" "They are exceptional," said Talk, who had a special fondness for numbers. "So that's where they come from," said Milo, looking in awe at the glittering collection of numbers. He returned them to the dodecahedron as carefully as possible, but as he did, one dropped to the floor with a smash and broke into 2. The humbug winced, and Milo looked terribly concerned. "Oh, don't worry about it," said the math magician as he scooped up the pieces. "We use the broken ones for fractions." "Haven't you any diamonds or emeralds or rubies?" asked the bug irritably, for he was quite disappointed in what he'd seen so far. "Yes, indeed," the math magician replied, leading to the rear of the cave. "Right this way." There, piled in enormous mounds that reached almost to the ceiling, were not only diamonds and emeralds and rubies, but also sapphires, amethysts, topazes, moonstones, and garnets. It was the most amazing mass of wealth that any of them had ever seen. "They're such a terrible nuisance," sighed the math magician, "and no one can think of what to do with them, so we just keep digging them up and throwing them out. Now," he said, taking a silver whistle from his pocket and blowing it loudly, "let's have some lunch." And for the first time in his life, the astonished bug couldn't think of a thing to say. Here's a better portrait of the math magician. He looks much less scary in that one. But you can see like the details of his robe. The illustrator, Jules Pfeiffer, definitely put little equations in there, some square roots and things. They're mostly scribbles, but it looks like math. All right, chapter 15. Oh, brilliant. We have time for 2 more chapters, y'all. Woohoo! And then on Sunday, we'll be finishing the Phantom Tollbooth. So I'll have to think about what to read next. If you have any suggestions, let me know. And let me try and make it so that I'm not cut in half by the light. Like that. Oh, wait, I think that's almost worse. Now my face is weird. Oh, I shouldn't have messed with it. Oh, no. Oh, everything's wrong. Oh, well, whatever. Oh, no, now it's annoying me. This is what happens when we do it live. Okay, there. Chapter 15, This Way to Infinity. Into the cavern rushed 8 of the strongest miners, carrying an immense cauldron which bubbled and sizzled and sent great clouds of savory steam spiraling slowly to the ceiling. Oh, that was a fun sentence. A sweet yet pungent aroma hung in the air and drifted easily from one anxious nose to the other, stopping only long enough to make several mouths water and a few stomachs growl. Milo, Tuck, and the humbug watched eagerly as the rest of the workers put down their tools and gathered around the big pot to help themselves. "Perhaps you'd care for something to eat," said the math magician, offering each of them a heaping bowlful. "Yes, sir," said Milo, who was beside himself with hunger. "Thank you," added Talk. The humbug made no reply, for he was already too busy eating, and in a moment the 3 of them had finished absolutely everything they'd been given. "Please have another portion," said the math magician, filling their bowls once more. And as quickly as they finished the first one, the second was emptied too. "Don't stop now," he insisted, serving them again, and again, and again, and again, and again. How strange, thought Milo, as he finished his 7th helping. Each one I eat makes me a little hungrier than before. Do have some more, suggested the math magician, and they continued to eat just as fast as he filled the plates. After Milo had eaten 9 portions, Talk 11, and the humbug, without stopping once to look up, 23, the math magician blew his whistle for a second time, and immediately the pot was removed and the miners returned to work. Oh, gasped the bug, suddenly realizing that he was 23 times hungrier than when he started. I think I'm starving. Me too, complained Milo, whose stomach felt as empty as he could ever remember. And I ate so much. Yes, wasn't it delicious? Agreed the pleased dodecahedron, wiping the gravy from several of his mouths. It's the specialty of the kingdom. Subtraction stew. I have more of an appetite than when I began, said Talk, leaning weakly against the larger rocks. Certainly, replied the math magician. What did you expect? The more you eat, the hungrier you get. Everyone knows that. They do, said Milo doubtfully. Then how do you never get enough? Oh, where did I get I have a cunning... I don't know where I got this shirt. I have no idea where I got this shirt from. It just appeared, but it's my Black Adder shirt, and I love it. Also, hello! Esoterica. I think I know who that is. Anyway, where was I? Enough, said the math magician impatiently. Here in Digitopolis, we have our meals when we're full and eat until we're hungry. That way, when you don't have anything at all, you have more than enough. It's a very economical system. You must have been quite stuffed to have eaten so much. It's completely logical, explained the dodecahedron. The more you want, the less you get. And the less you get, the more you have. Simple arithmetic, that's all. Suppose you had something and added something to it. What would that make? More, said Milo quickly. Quite correct, he nodded. Now, suppose you had something and added nothing to it. What would you have? The same, he answered again, without much conviction. Splendid, cried the dodecahedron. And suppose you had something and added less than nothing to it. What would you have then? Famine, roared the anguished humbug, who suddenly realized that was exactly what he'd eaten 23 bowls of. It's not as bad as all that, said the dodecahedron from his most sympathetic face. In a few hours, you'll be nice and full again, just in time for dinner. Oh dear, said Milo sadly and softly. I only eat when I'm hungry. What a curious idea, said the math magician, raising his staff over his head and scrubbing the rubber end back and forth several times on the ceiling. The next thing you'll have us believe is that you only sleep when you're tired. And by the time he'd finished the sentence, the cavern, the miners, and the dodecahedron had vanished, leaving just the 4 of them standing in the math magician's workshop. He erased it with his eraser. Oh, cool. Hold on, I'm reading that comment. Oh, long series of books. Yeah, I was actually thinking of doing Pride and Prejudice next, because I haven't read Jane Austen in a few years. So we might do Pride and Prejudice. Or, well, anyway, I will focus. I often find, he casually explained to his dazed visitors, that the best way to get from one place to another is to erase everything and begin again. Please do make yourself at home. Do you always travel that way? Asked Milo as he glanced curiously at the strange circular room whose 16 tiny arched windows corresponded exactly to the 16 points of the compass. Around the entire circumference were numbers from 0 to 300, and around the entire circumference were numbers from 0 to 360, marking the degrees of the circle. And on the floor, walls, tables, chairs, desks, cabinets, and ceiling were labels showing their heights, widths, depths, and distances to and from each other. To one side was a gigantic notepad set on an artist's easel, and from hooks and strings hung a collection of scales, rulers, measures, weights, tapes, and all sorts of other devices for measuring any number of things in every possible way. No, indeed, replied the math magician, and this time he raised the sharpened end of his staff and drew a thin, straight line in the air, and then walked gracefully across it from one side of the room to the other. Most of the time, I take the shortest distance between any 2 points. And of course, when I should be in several places at once, he remarked, writing 7 times 1 equals 7 carefully on the notepad, I simply multiply. Suddenly, there were 7 mathematicians standing side by side, and each one looked exactly like the other. How did you do that? Gasped Milo. There's nothing to it, they all said in chorus. If you have a magic staff. Then the 6 of them canceled themselves out and simply disappeared. But it's only a big pencil, the humbug objected, tapping at it with his cane. True enough, agreed the mathematician, but once you learn to use it, there's no end to what you can do. Can you make things disappear? Asked Milo excitedly. Why, certainly, he said, striding over to the easel. Just step a little closer and watch carefully. After demonstrating that there was nothing up his sleeves, in his hat, or behind his back, he wrote quickly this equation, which I will read out loud. 4 plus 9 minus 2 times 16 plus 1 divided by 3 times 6 minus 67 plus 8 times 2 minus 3 plus 26 minus 1 divided by 34 plus 3 divided by 7 plus 2 minus 5 equals. Then he looked up expectantly. 17! Shouted the bug, who always managed to be first with the wrong answer. It all comes to 0, corrected Milo. Precisely, said the mathematician, making a very theatrical bow, and the entire line of numbers disappeared before their eyes. Now, is there anything else you'd like to see? Yes, please, said Milo. Can you show me the biggest number there is? I'd be delighted, he replied, opening one of the closet doors. We keep it right here. It took 4 miners just to dig it out. Inside was the biggest 3 Milo had ever seen. It was fully twice as high as the mathematician. That's not what I mean, objected Milo. Can you show me the longest number there is? Surely, said the mathematician, opening another door. Here it is. It took 3 carts to carry it here. Inside this closet was the longest 8 imaginable. It was just about as wide as the 3 was high. No, that's not what I meant either, said Milo, looking helplessly at Hawk. I think what you would like to see, said the dog, scratching himself just under 4:30, is the number of greatest possible magnitude. Well, why didn't you say so, said the mathematician, who was busily measuring the edge of a raindrop. What's the greatest number you can think of? 9,999,999,999,999, recited Milo breathlessly. Very good, said the mathematician. Now add 1 to it. Now add 1 again, he repeated when Milo had added the previous one. Now add 1 again. Now add 1 again. Now add 1 again. Now add 1 again. But when can I stop? Pleaded Milo. Never, said the mathematician with a little smile, for the number you want is always at least 1 more than the number you've got, and it's so large that if you started saying it yesterday, you wouldn't finish tomorrow. Where could you ever find a number so big? Scoffed the humbug. In the same place they have the smallest number there is, the mathematician answered helpfully. And you know what that is? Certainly, said the bug, suddenly remembering something to do at the other end of the room. 1 millionth? Asked Milo, trying to think of the smallest fraction possible. Almost, said the mathematician. Now divide it in half. Now divide it in half again. 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 Oh dear, shouted Milo, holding his hands to his ears. Doesn't that ever stop either? How can it, said the mathematician, when you can always take half of whatever you have left until it's so small that if you started to say it right now, you'd finish before you even began? Where could you keep something so tiny? Milo asked, trying very hard to imagine such a thing. The mathematician stopped what he was doing and explained simply, why, in a box that's so small you can't see it, and that's kept in a drawer that's so small you can't see it, In a dresser that's so small you can't see it. In a house that's so small you can't see it. On a street that's so small you can't see it. In a city that's so small you can't see it, which is in part of a country that's so small you can't see it. In a world that's so small you can't see it. Then he sat down, fanned himself with a handkerchief, and continued. Then, of course, we keep the whole thing in another box that's so small you can't see it, and if you follow me, I'll show you where to find it. They walked to one end of the small windows, and there, tied to the sill, was one end of a line that stretched along the ground and into the distance until completely out of sight. Just follow that line forever, said the math magician, and when you reach the end, turn left. There you'll find the land of infinity, where the tallest, the shortest, the biggest, the smallest, and the most and the least of everything are kept. I really don't have that much time, said Milo anxiously. Isn't there a quicker way? Well, you might try this flight of stairs, he suggested, opening another door and pointing up. It goes there, too. Milo bounded across the room and started up the stairs 2 at a time. Wait for me, please, he shouted to Talk in the humbug. I'll be gone just a few minutes. But will he? More comments. The Dragon of Dorcastle. Well, I don't have to read every book out loud. I could always read something for pleasure, and I'm always looking for good recommendations. So thank you, Amanda.
Yes.
Yay! I remembered your name! Yay! And I hope I am right. I hope Esoterica is Becca. Yeah, it is Becca. Yay! Up he went, very quickly at first. Oh, this is chapter 16, A Very Dirty Bird. Up he went, very quickly at first. Yes, lol. Okay. Then more slowly. Then a little while, even more slowly than that. And finally, after many minutes of climbing up the endless stairway, one weary foot was barely able to follow the other. Milo suddenly realized that with all his effort, he was no closer to the top than when he began, and not a great deal further from the bottom. But he struggled on for a while longer, until at last, completely exhausted, he collapsed onto one of the steps. I should have known it, he mumbled, resting his tired legs and filling his lungs with air. This is just like the line that goes on forever, and I'll never get there. You wouldn't like it much anyway, someone replied gently. Infinity is a dreadfully poor place. They can never manage to make ends meet. Milo looked up, with his head resting heavily on his hand. He was becoming quite accustomed to being addressed at the oddest times in the oddest places by the oddest people. And this time he was not at all disappointed. Standing next to him on the step was exactly one half of a small child who had been divided neatly from top to bottom. There. You can see both the infinity staircase and the half a boy. I love this style of illustration. I think it's very simple but very evocative. Pardon me for staring, said Milo, after he had been staring for some time, but I've never seen half a child before. It's 0.58 to be precise, replied the child from the left side of his mouth, which happened to be the only side of his mouth. I beg your pardon, said Milo. It's 0.58, he repeated. It's a little bit more than half. Have you always been that way? Asked Milo impatiently, for he felt that it was a needlessly fine distinction. My goodness, no, the child assured him. A few years ago, I was just 0.42, and believe me, that was terribly inconvenient. What is the rest of your family like? Said Milo, this time a bit more sympathetically. Oh, we're just the average family, he said thoughtfully. Mother, father, and 2.58 children. And, as I explained, I'm the 0.58. It must be rather odd being only part of a person, Milo remarked. Not at all, said the child. Every average family has 2.58 children, so I always have someone to play with. Besides, each family also has an average of 1.3 automobiles, and since I'm the only one who could drive 3/10 of a car, I get to use it all the time. But averages aren't real, objected Milo. They're just imaginary. That may be so, he agreed, but they're also very useful at times. For instance, if you didn't have any money at all, but you happened to be with 4 other people who had $10 apiece, then you'd each have an average of $8. Isn't that right? I guess so, said Milo weakly. Well, think of how much better off you'd be just because of averages, he explained convincingly. And think of the poor farmer when it doesn't rain all year. If there wasn't an average yearly rainfall of 37 inches in this part of the country, all his crops would wither and die. It all sounded terribly confusing for Milo, for he'd always had trouble in school with just this subject. There are still other advantages, continued the child. For instance, if one rat were cornered by 9 cats, then on the average, each cat would be 10% rat, and the rat would be 90% cat. If you happen to be a rat, you can see how much nicer it would make things. But that can never be, said Milo, jumping to his feet. Don't be too sure, said the child patiently, for one of the nicest things about mathematics, or anything else you might care to learn, is that many of the things which can never be, often are. You see, he went on, it's very much like you're trying to reach infinity. You know that it's there, but you just don't know where. But just because you can never reach it, it doesn't mean it's not worth looking for. I hadn't thought of it that way, said Milo, starting down the stairs. I think I'll go back now. A wise decision, the child agreed, but try again someday. Perhaps you'll get much closer. And as Milo waved goodbye, he smiled warmly, which he usually did on the average of 47 times per day. Everyone here knows so much more than I do, thought Milo as he leaped from step to step. I'll have to do a lot better if I'm going to rescue the princesses. In a few moments, he'd reached the bottom again and burst into the workshop, where Talk and the Humbug were eagerly watching the math magician perform. Ah, back already, he cried, greeting him with a friendly wave. I hope you found what you were looking for. I'm afraid not, admitted Milo. And then he added in a very discouraged tone, Everything in Digitopolis is much too difficult for me. The math magician nodded knowingly and stroked his chin several times. You'll find, he remarked gently, that the only thing you can do easily is be wrong, and that's hardly worth the effort. That's a great sentence! The only thing you can do easily is be wrong. Milo tried very hard to understand all the things he'd been told and all the things he'd seen, and as he spoke, one curious thing still bothered him. Why is it, he said quietly, that quite often even the things which are correct just don't seem to be right? A look of deep melancholy crossed the math magician's face, and his eyes grew moist with sadness. Everything was silent, and it was several minutes before he was able to reply at all. How very true, he sobbed, supporting himself on the staff. It has been that way since rhyme and reason were banished. Quite so, began the Humbug. I personally feel that. And all because of that stubborn wretch Azaz, roared the math magician, completely overwhelming the bug, for now his sadness had changed to fury, and he stalked about the room, adding up anger and multiplying wrath. It's all his fault. Perhaps if you discussed it with him, Milo started to say, but never had time to finish. Pardon me. He's much too unreasonable, interrupted the math magician again. Why, just last month I sent him a very friendly letter, which he never had the courtesy to answer. See for yourself. He handed Milo a copy of the letter, which read, 4,738, 1919, 667, 394017, 5841, 62589, 85371, 14, 3958 7190 434, 203, 27 689, 57 131, 48 1206, 58 64, 98 053, 62, 62 17 98 75 0 73. Maybe he doesn't understand numbers, said Milo, who found it a little difficult to read himself. There are the numbers. Tell Alex that one of the main characters' name in Dragon of Door Castles is Elaine, and that's where I got his name from.
Ah, cool.
You have been told. He has been told.
Got told.
Maybe he doesn't understand numbers, said Milo, who found it a little difficult to read himself. Nonsense, bellowed the math magician. Everyone understands numbers. No matter what language you speak, they always mean the same thing. A 7 is a 7 anywhere in the world. My goodness, thought Milo. Everybody is so terribly sensitive about the things they know best. With your permission, said Talk, changing the subject. Talk is MVP, by the way. Siren, go away. Oh, it went away. With your permission, said Talk, changing the subject, we'd like to rescue Rhyme and Reason. Has agreed to it? The math magician inquired. Yes, sir, the dog assured him. Then I don't, he thundered again, for since they've been banished, we never agree on anything, and we never will. He emphasized his last remark with a dark and ominous look. Never? Asked Milo, with the slightest touch of disbelief in his voice. Never, he repeated, and if you can prove otherwise, you have my permission to go. Well, said Milo, who had thought about this problem very carefully ever since leaving Digitopolis, then whenever Azaz agrees, you disagree. Correct, said the math magician, with a tolerant smile. And with whatever Azaz disagrees, you agree. Also correct, yawned the math magician, nonchalantly cleaning his fingernails with the point of his staff. Then each of you agrees that he will disagree with whatever each of you agrees with, said Milo triumphantly. And if you both disagree with the same thing, then aren't you really in agreement? I've been tricked, cried the math magician helplessly, for no matter how he figured, it still came out just that way. Splendid effort, cried the humbug jovially. Exactly the way I would have done it. And now, may we go? Added Talk. The math magician accepted his defeat with grace, nodded weakly, and then drew the three travelers to his side. It is a long and dangerous journey, he began softly, and a furrow of concern creased his forehead. Long before you find them, the demons will know you're there. Watch for them well, he emphasized, for when they appear, it might be too late. The humbug shuddered down to his shoes, and Milo felt the tips of his fingers suddenly grow cold. But there is one problem, even more serious than that, he whispered ominously. What is it? Gasped Milo, who was not really sure he wanted to know. I'm afraid I can only tell you when you return. Come along, said the math magician, and I'll show you the way. And simply by carrying the three, he transported them all to the very edge of Digitopolis. Behind them lay all the kingdoms of wisdom, and up ahead, oh, it's the land of wisdom! I had no idea that's what the kingdom name was. Oh. Let's see, where was I? Oh, yes. Behind them lay all the kingdoms of wisdom, and up ahead, a narrow, rutted path led toward the mountains and darkness. We'll never get the car up that, said Milo unhappily. True enough, replied the math magician, but you can be in ignorance quick enough without riding all the way, and if you're to be successful, it will have to be step by step. But I would like to take my gifts, insisted Milo. So you shall, announced the dodecahedron, who appeared from nowhere with his arms full. Here are your sights, here are your sounds, and here, he said, handing Milo the last of them disdainfully, are your words. And most important of all, added the math magician, here is your own magic staff. Use it well, and there is nothing you cannot do. He placed in Milo's breast pocket a small, gleaming pencil which, except for the size, was much like his own. Then, with a last word of encouragement, and he and the dodecahedron, who was simultaneously sobbing, frowning, pining, and sighing from 4 of his saddest faces, made their farewells and watched as the 3 tiny figures disappeared into the forbidding mountains of ignorance. This is a lovely scene to look at there. There you go. That's the math magician carrying them to the edge of Digitopolis and the kingdom of wisdom, which has no rhyme or reason. Trying not to get weird light in my face. Almost immediately, the light began to fade as the difficult path wandered aimlessly upward, inching toward almost as reluctantly as the trembling humbug. Talk, as usual, led the way, sniffing ahead for danger, and Milo, his bag of precious possessions slung over one shoulder, followed silently and resolutely behind. "Perhaps someone should stay back to guard the way," said the unhappy Bug, offering his services, but since his suggestion was met with silence, he followed glumly along. The higher they went, the darker it became, though it wasn't the darkness of night, but rather more like a mixture of lurking shadows and evil intentions, which oozed from the slimy, moss-covered cliffs and blotted out the light. A cruel wind shrieked through the rocks, and the air was thick and heavy, as if it had been used several times before. On they went, higher and higher up the dizzying trail, on one side the sheer stone walls and brutal peaks towering above them, and on the other an endless, limitless, bottomless nothing. "I can hardly see a thing," said Milo, taking hold of Tock's tail as a sticky mist engulfed the moon. "Perhaps we should wait until morning." "There'll be morning for you soon enough," came a reply from above, and this was followed by a hideous cackling laugh, very much like someone choking on a fishbone. Clinging. "Siren! Go away!" Clinging to one of the greasy rocks and blending almost perfectly with it was a large, unkempt, and exceedingly soiled bird, who looked more like a dirty floor mop than anything else. He had a sharp, dangerous beak, and the one eye he chose to open stared down maliciously. "Here is the very dirty bird." "I don't think you understand," said Milo timidly as the watchdog growled a warning. "We're looking for a place to spend the night." "It's not yours to spend!" the bird shrieked again, and followed it with the same horrible laugh. "That doesn't make any sense, you see," he started to explain. "Dollars or cents, it's still not yours to spend," the bird replied haughtily. "But I didn't mean," insisted Milo. "Of course you're mean," interrupted the bird, closing the eye that had been open and opening one that had been closed. "Anyone who'd spend a night that doesn't belong to him is very mean." "Well, I thought that he tried again desperately. "That's a different story," interjected the bird a bit more amiably. "If you want to buy, I'm sure I can arrange to sell, but with what you're doing, you'll probably end up in a cell anyway." "That doesn't seem right," said Milo helplessly, for with the bird taking everything the wrong way, he hardly knew what he was saying. "Agreed," said the bird with a sharp click of his beak. "But neither is it left, although if I were you, I would have left a long time ago." "Let me try once more," said Milo, in an effort to explain. "In other words—" "You mean you have other words?" cried the bird happily. "Well, by all means, use them. You're certainly not doing very well with the ones you have now." "Must you always interrupt like that?" said Tock irritably, for even he was becoming impatient. "Naturally," the bird cackled. "It's my job. I take the words right out of your mouth. Haven't we met before? I'm the ever-present word snatcher, and I'm sure I know your friend the Bug." And then he leaned all the way forward and gave them a terrible, knowing smile. There's the Bug in the corner, cowering, like all humbugs do. The humbug, who was too big to hide and too frightened to move, denied everything. "Is everyone who lives in ignorance like you?" asked Milo. "Much worse," the bird said longingly. "But I don't live here. I'm from a place very far away, called Context." "Don't you think you should be getting back?" suggested the Bug, holding one arm up in front of him. "What a horrible thought," the bird shuddered. "It's such an unpleasant place that I spend almost all my time out of it. Besides, what could be nicer than these grimy mountains?" "Almost anything," thought Milo as he pulled his collar up. And then he asked the bird, "Are you a demon?" "I'm afraid not," he replied sadly, as several filthy tears rolled down his beak. "I've tried, but the best I can manage is to be a nuisance." And before Milo could reply, he flapped his dingy wings and flew off in a cascade of dust and dirt and fuzz. "Wait!" shouted Milo, who'd thought of many more questions he wanted to ask. "£34!" shrieked the bird as he disappeared into the fog. He was certainly no help, said Milo, after they had been walking for some time. It is Mermaid. Mermaid? Mermaid? I don't know that phrase. Oh, yes, and Tyrants do have to be tolerated. Anyway, I'm almost done with this chapter. Sorry for keeping you guys so long. Let's see. He was certainly no help, said Milo, after they had been walking for some time. That's why I drove him off, cried the humbug, fiercely brandishing his cane. Now let's find the demons. That might be sooner than you think, remarked Talk, looking back at the suddenly trembling bug, and the trail turned and continued to climb. In a few minutes, they'd reached the crest, only to find that beyond it lay another one even higher, and beyond that several more, whose tops were lost in the swirling darkness. For a short stretch, the path became broad and flat, and just ahead, leaning comfortably against a dead tree, stood a very elegant-looking gentleman. He was beautifully dressed in a dark suit with a well-pressed shirt and tie. His shoes were polished, his nails were clean, his hat was well-brushed, and a white handkerchief adorned his breast pocket. But his expression was somewhat blank. In fact, it was completely blank, for he had neither eyes, nor nose, nor mouth. Slenderman! No. Oh, it's Mermaid. Artists draw mermaids during Mermaid. That's adorable. I'm an artist now, and I have a mermaid up. Holy crap, I should paint a mermaid. I'm totally going to do that, and that's going to replace that painting right there. Oh, yeah. Anyway. Hello, little boy, the demon. Well, he's not a demon. You can kind of guess that. Hello, little boy, the gentleman said, amiably shaking Milo by the hand. And how's the faithful dog? He inquired, giving Talk 3 or 4 strong and friendly pats. And who is this handsome creature? He said, tipping his hat to the very pleased humbug. I'm so happy to see you all. What a pleasant surprise to meet someone so nice, they all thought, and especially here. I wonder if you could spare me a little of your time, he inquired politely, and help with a few small jobs. Why, of course, said the humbug cheerfully. Gladly, added Talk. Yes, indeed, said Milo, who wondered for just a moment how it was possible for someone so agreeable to have a face with no features at all. Splendid, the gentleman said happily, for there are just 3 tasks. Firstly, I would like you to move this pile from here to there, he explained, pointing to an enormous mound of fine sand. But I'm afraid that all I have are these tiny tweezers. And he gave them to Milo, who immediately began transporting 1 grain at a time. Secondly, I would like to empty this well and fill the other, but I have no bucket, so you'll have to use this eyedropper. And he handed it to Talk, who undertook at once to carry 1 drop at a time from well to well. And lastly, I must have a hole through this cliff, and here is a needle to dig it. The eager humbug quickly set to work, picking at the solid granite. When they had all been safely started, the very pleasant man returned to the tree, and leaning against it once more, continued to stare vacantly down the trail, while Milo and Talk and the humbug worked hour after hour after hour after hour. End of chapter. Ta-da! All right, and then that was chapter 17, so let's see. Oh, my goodness. No, that was the end of chapter 16. So we only have 4 more chapters left. Yay! And then we're done. So we will be done on, what is today? Today is Thursday? We will be done on Sunday. So Tuesday will be the beginning of a new book, and that's very exciting. And thank you for joining me, as always. It's lovely to do this, and it's so nice to do this with a computer that works. Stay safe, stay happy, read lots of books. I love you all. End stream.